So I'm happy to introduce Shaun Booth. Shaun Booth is on a mission to change the way we see our gardens. After graduating from Fleming College as an ecosystem management technician and working with a local conservation authority, Shaun went on to create In Our Nature, an ecological garden design company and native plant nursery. In Our Nature was founded on the belief that nature should not be restricted to far off conservation areas and parks, but should be right here in our own backyards too. Shaun's design work focuses on the creation of aesthetically pleasing, low maintenance, ecologically beneficial landscapes that invite nature back into our lives. So welcome, Shaun.
All right, hello everybody. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really a big fan of this speaker series, so I'm really happy to be on this end of the presentation. So I'm going to share my screen there. All right, so the theme of our talk tonight is, of course, edible native plants. And this is really one of my favorite topics just because it merges two really big themes in gardening right now, which are native plants and growing your own food. So we all have our own reasons for growing our own food, whether it's for self-sufficiency or just simply enjoying tasty, fresh, healthy food. What is actually the value in growing specifically edible native plants? Well, the big reason for choosing native plants is to bring back some of the habitat that's been lost to development, such as subdivisions and parking lots. So I'm sure most of us can think back to a natural area or a wild space from our childhoods, or maybe in more recent memory, that has since been lost to urbanization and development. So something that was once a forest filled with birdsong or a meadow full of butterflies, it now looks something like this, a lot of houses and concrete. So as urbanization consumes our natural areas, our native plants and animal species are essentially being pushed to extinction. And when we lose these natural areas, we don't only lose the wildlife, but we lose the ecosystem services they provide, such as habitat, clean air, clean water, flood mitigation, and even the pollination services that help produce a lot of our food. Now, any green spaces that are generally found in urban areas, they're typically characterized by manicured lawns and gardens that are full of exotic plants that don't really resemble don't resemble the ecosystem that was once there. Now, the property in this photo, it's definitely not providing the same level of ecosystem services as the ecosystem that was once there. And the reality is that if you're not producing, the land that you're living on is not producing these services, then you have to borrow them from somewhere else. And this is just not sustainable. So we may think there's enough natural areas in conservation parks or outside of our neighborhoods to provide us with these ecosystem services. But the reality is that these natural areas are becoming too few and far between. So the natural areas that we do have, they're really small and they're disconnected from each other, just like you can see in this picture. So when habitats disconnected by human activity, we call this fragmentation. Now, when habitats are fragmented, it reduces their resilience and also their ability to support life on Earth, including human life. But this is where our gardens come in. So they become such powerful tools for wildlife conservation. All we have to do is start thinking about our gardens a little bit differently. And we start to realize that they hold a lot of potential to bring back some of this habitat that's been lost. And every garden, no matter how big or how small, it can act as a stepping stone to basically connect these fragmented habitats together. Now, I strongly believe that when we do this, our gardens take on a much deeper meaning than simply looks alone. Because we're now inviting butterflies and songbirds back into our yards, and we're also restoring these many important environmental services. Now, of course, the first step in bringing nature back into our yards begins with native plants. So native plants are those that have grown naturally in our area for thousands of years. And over this time, they've developed these special bonds with local wildlife. A really good example of this is how the caterpillars of the infamous monarch butterfly rely heavily on milkweed to survive. Now, we can't just replace milkweed with boxwoods or hostas and expect them to survive because they simply can't eat anything else. Now, many of these native plants are edible for humans too. So when we include them in our landscapes, we have the ability to support local ecology while feeding ourselves. And that's really a win-win situation. Now, in addition, most native edibles are perennial food sources, meaning we plant them once and we can harvest their bounty for many years to come. Now, I don't know about you, but when it comes to gardening and growing food, I like doing as little work as possible for the most reward, and perennial crops are definitely the key to doing just that. Now, of course, indigenous people used native plants for food and medicine for many generations before Europeans settled this area. Uh, and as Europeans brought over these food crops and plowed over the land, the use of many of these plants was lost to history. So bringing them back and planting them in our landscapes is a great way to acknowledge the cultural and the natural history of our area. So I'm going to go through some of my favorite native edibles by examining how they're a good fit for our gardens, how we can eat them, and also how they benefit local wildlife. Now, these plants provide both flowers and food, so we can incorporate them into vegetable gardens or flower gardens alike because they're multi-purpose species. So one thing I do want to note before we go on is that you always need to do your due diligence, do your research, make sure you know what you're eating. A good way to do this is to focus on identifying plants by their scientific name. Now, a lot of people, this might sound intimidating, but it's really important that we make sure we're choosing the right plant, as many different plants can have the same common name. Now, I've also made sure to choose plants that are available commercially, so you shouldn't really have a problem finding any of these if you go through your local native plant nursery. All right, so our first plant is the wild leek. It's also known as ramps. They're popping up across southern Ontario as we speak. This picture I actually took it a couple days ago now. So these are most commonly found in deciduous forests with really rich soil. So if your garden has dappled shade with really organically rich soil, then you should have no problem growing them. Now, they're also known as spring ephemerals. So this means that they do most of their growing before the trees above them have leafed out. Then they go dormant by midsummer. And because of this, they need to be in the shade of a tree that loses its leaves in the fall. So this means that they won't do well in the deep shade of an evergreen tree or the deep shade of a building. Now, leeks are one of the most commonly over-harvested wild edibles. So by growing them in our gardens, we can hopefully take pressure off of the wild populations. And the reason that they're so commonly over-harvested is because they take about 7 years to flower from seed. So when wild populations are unsustainably harvested, they can really take a long time to recover, or sometimes they just never recover at all. So the most sustainable way to harvest the leeks is simply just to pick one leaf off of each plant. They generally only have 1 to 2 leaves. Now, they're very slow growing, as I said, so harvesting them sustainably is critical. Now, the leaves have a really strong flavor that's kind of like a cross between an onion and garlic with, I think, a little hints of sweetness in there. Now, if you're harvesting the bulb, you really want to make sure to cut off the roots and put the roots back in the ground. This will allow them to regrow. Now, the leaves can be used basically in the same way as green onions. You can try them in omelets, salads, savory baking, and even pesto. Now, the bulbs can be used similar to shallots. They can be pickled as well. Now, because of their very short harvest time, it's important to preserve them in some ways so you can freeze them for later on in the year. And a lot of people will even dry them. Now, the flowers, they actually appear in early to midsummer after the leaves have faded away. Now, these flowers are visited by early bees such as sweat bees, mining bees, and even bumblebee queens. Now, the strong onion flavor means that they're not very popular with deer or rabbits. Now, if you love the idea of having wild leek, but you don't have the right growing conditions for it, then you can try nodding onion instead. So this is a super tough plant. It thrives in full sun and dry, nutrient-poor soils. And it also has a really strong onion taste and can be used in very much the same way as leeks. All right, so next we have Virginia waterleaf. This is another shade-loving plant that greens up really early in the springtime. It's naturally found in moist forests, and often in the same habitat as leeks, actually. But this one does in fact keep its leaves throughout the growing season. Now, in your garden, it makes a really great ground cover in dappled shade with moist to average soil, and it spreads quite nicely to cover the ground. So in about late spring, early summer, it'll come out with these beautiful bell-shaped flower clusters. And the flowers can range from a lavender color to about pink or white. This really depends on the plant. The most common color I've seen personally is a pale lavender color. Now, this likes to spread through seeds and to a lesser extent rhizomes. So if you want to fill in a trouble spot or a large area, then this is the perfect plant. So the early season leaves of this plant, as you can see in the picture on the bottom right, they kind of look like they've been stained white by water, and this is where it gets its name from. Now, the young leaves of Virginia waterleaf are edible. So if you have Virginia waterleaf popping up right now, it's the perfect time to eat them. So they're edible raw or even in a salad, or you can even prepare them as cooked greens like spinach. You wouldn't really necessarily want to make an entire salad solely out of water leaf, but they do make a nice addition. Now you can also use them as spinach if you want to cook them or saute them, but it's definitely either way, it's best to harvest the younger leaves before the flowers appear. Otherwise they kind of become bitter and tough. Now I just enjoy picking them out of the garden. They taste similar to lettuce, but they don't have that bitter aftertaste unless they get too mature. Now, some people may be turned off by the very fine hairs, but I don't personally have a problem with it. Now, the flowers, besides being beautiful, they're valued by pollinators, especially native bees. They benefit from nectar and pollen. And you can expect to see mining bees, sweat bees, carpenter bees, and even bumblebees. Now, the importance of bees has really grabbed media attention in recent years. Have you ever thought about how many bee species we actually have in Ontario? So Ontario is actually home to about 400 different native or wild bee species. Now, honeybees often dominate the media spotlight, but in reality, they're only one of many bee species found in Ontario, and they're not even native. So honeybees were introduced by early settlers, and they can be seen similar to livestock such as chickens or cows. And although they are very important to agriculture, they're not really of significant ecological concern in North America. So when you hear me talk about bees, I'm going to be referring to the 400 species of native bee. Now, our native bees, they look and act much differently to honeybees. They don't nest in hives, they're actually solitary nesters. This means about 70% of them will live in the ground, and the other 30% will live in hollow cavities or hollow stems. So before I scare you off with the idea of bees living in your garden and in the ground, I do want to note that because they're solitary nesters, these bees live by themselves and they don't actually have a hive to protect. So your chances of being stung by one is very slim. So you can really feel comfortable getting up close to them. Now, many of our native bees look much different to honeybees, just like this metallic green sweat bee. And the media's disproportionate focus on the honeybee has really led native bees to be unknown and forgotten. And this is unfortunate because they're often much better pollinators than honeybees. So we really can't talk about growing food without talking about the native bees that pollinate much of the food we eat. All right, so next on our list, you may be surprised to hear that we have a native plum. Well, Canada plum is found in meadows, forest edges, and thickets. So in your garden, it'll do well in full sun to part shade with moist to average soil. Now, it is a small tree. It'll grow up to about 10 meters high. And as you can see in the picture, it puts on a beautiful display of really fragrant white flowers. Now, the fruit can be eaten raw or cooked. Now, French explorer Jacques Cartier, he made his way up the St. Lawrence River. And when he did so, the First Nation communities that he met presented his party with dried wild plums. Now, it's this indigenous knowledge that helped him and his people survive our very harsh winters. Now, they taste best after a good frost has hit them, and you can basically use them any way you would use a store-bought plum. So you can eat them fresh, you can dry them, or you can even use them in preserves or baking. Now, they're definitely not as sweet as cultivated plums. So generally they're better used for preserves or baking. Now, Canada plums, they bloom in the springtime. So of course, they're a very important food source for pollinators, mainly native bee species, but you will also see some early butterflies visiting them. Now, just like many other prunus species, the wild plum leaves, they feed the caterpillars of many butterflies, such as the viceroy and the elfin. So you can see a picture of a viceroy on the right there. Now, wildlife, they really love the fruit as much as we do. So if you want some, you'll have to get to them early. The stem also produces very sparse thorns, which makes it a desirable nesting site for birds who like the extra protection. So next plant would be redbud. It's naturally found along forest edges, forests and clearings. So if your garden has part sun to part shade with rich, well-draining soil, then you shouldn't have a hard time growing redbud. It does like to be in a sheltered location because it's very prone to being broken by the wind or ice. So in early spring, redbud will bloom profusely with pink flowers that resemble those of peas. I'm sure there's some redbud blooming in the most southern part of Ontario right now. Now, in the summertime, it has these really broad heart-shaped leaves, which turn a vibrant yellow color in the fall. And how do we eat it? Well, the flowers are edible. They can be used in salads, preserves, baking, or basically anywhere else that you would use an edible flower. So they're rich in nectar, so they have a slightly sweet taste. And the young leaves can even be used in salads. And the young seed pods can also be cooked similar to green beans. So redbud provides a copious nectar source for bees really early in the springtime. So you can expect bumblebees, mason bees, longhorn bees, and even some butterflies to visit your redbud. Now, if we look closer, we may notice some circular holes that have been cut out of the leaves. These holes have likely been made by female leafcutter bees. So leafcutter bees are one of the 30% of our native bees, which nest in hollow stems and other cavities. So the female leafcutter bee will cut these small circular discs of foliage, and she'll use them to line her nesting cavities. Now, as you can see in the lower portion of this cross section, the cells within the cavity are lined with leaves. So each cell is provisioned with a ball of pollen, and when the eggs that she lays hatch into small larvae, they'll consume the pollen as they grow and develop. Then after about several weeks, the larvae will transform into adults and they'll emerge from the hollow stems. So I like to say that the leaves that she's cutting out are basically baby bee blankets. So redbud seems to be a really popular choice for them. I think this is because the leaves are nice and tender. So not only are you growing beautiful edible flowers, but you're helping the bees raise their young. Now, elderberries is our next shrub. They can be found growing along roads, forest edges, wetland edges, or basically anywhere the ground is on the moist side and there's a decent amount of sun. Now, it's easy to grow in most gardens, as long as you have moist to average soil that doesn't dry out completely. Now, it's very fragrant. These beautiful white flat top flower clusters, they bloom in late spring. And the leaves, you can see they add a nice lacy, delicate texture to a garden. Now, the ripe fruit, it's normally cooked and used in pies, jams, jellies, sauces, or juices. Now, they're very high in vitamin C, and they're often made into a cold and flu remedy. Now, the flowers, they can be picked as well, but only when they're fully open. Otherwise, they're not edible. And you can use them in candies, or you can soak them in water to make a beautiful tasting carbonated beverage. Now, you do need to be careful with elderberry. As I said, the unripe fruits and the unopened flowers are not edible. So as for wildlife value, elderberry flowers have no nectar, but they do provide pollinators with an abundance of pollen. So you can expect carpenter bees, sweat bees, bumblebees, mason bees to visit. The berries are also eaten by wildlife, and they're especially valuable to birds such as cedar waxwings who only eat fruit. Now, the hollow stems are especially valuable to cavity nesting bees because they provide excellent nesting sites. All right, so next we have sunchoke. This is one of my favorites. It's a native sunflower that can be found growing in moist meadows across southern Ontario. Now, they grow very tall. Mine often top out at around 7 or 8 feet tall. So this is a very adaptable plant. It'll grow in all but the driest of soils, and it grows very quickly. So some people will avoid it due to this aggressive nature, But when it comes to producing food, I think this is what we want. Any plant that can grow in the ground with zero effort or inputs is a winner in my books. Now, sunchokes produce edible tubers. They're best harvested in late fall or early spring, especially after a few good hard frosts have hit them. They don't store for very long, so they're best used wherever you can preserve them. When they're raw, they kind of have a texture of a potato or a chestnut, but when you cook them, they take on the texture of a potato. And they're very versatile. You can use them like potatoes or cauliflower. You can roast them, you can fry them, boil them, steam or grill them. And you can even turn them into pickles. Now, as for wildlife value, it's a sunflower species, so it attracts tons of butterflies who are attracted to the large open flowers. And the leaves of Helianthus species, like sunchoke, they're eaten by a variety of caterpillar species, which then go on to feed birds. And of course, the seed heads, if left over winter, they'll feed birds too. So our next plant is groundnut. Now, it's naturally found in along shorelines, moist areas, and anywhere with part sun to full sun exposure. Now, in your garden, it'll do well with light shade to full sun, moist to average soil, and it does like a good amount of organic matter. So they're very easy to grow. It's a legumes, so the root system will actually fix nitrogen in the soil. And it's not a woody vine, so it's going to die back to the ground every year. So if you have this growing over an arbor or trellis, it's not going to completely engulf it. Now, it is a vine and it has these beautiful pea-like flowers, which appear in midsummer into fall. And they can grow very quickly, so it's best to grow them somewhere where you can control them. Now, groundnut is a 2-in-1 edible plant. It produces both edible tubers and seed pods. So the tubers are essentially the North American version of the potato. They're really high in protein, and they were used extensively by Native Americans who would boil them with maple syrup. Now, the bean pods can be used like regular green beans, and they're best harvested while they're still very young and tender. Then when it comes to wildlife value, the flowers are visited mainly by bees and flies. So this includes bumblebees, leafcutter bees, and flies are known to be one of their main pollinators because they're attracted to the strange sweet smell of the flowers. Now, deer do feed the foliage, so keep that in mind. So next we have hazelnut. Now, this is an understory shrub. It's generally found in forests, forest edges and meadows, and even savannas. Now, they'll do well in gardens with sun to shade with average, well-draining soil. So they do grow in shade as well, but they do produce more nuts if they're grown in the sun. So you can use hazelnuts as a hedgerow or a backdrop for other species, and their dense growth habit makes them highly desirable for nesting birds. So the nuts, they're ready to collect in late summer into autumn. Now, as soon as the husks have yellowed, you can harvest them. Now, you can either pick them from the tree or you can shake them off onto a tarp. Now, you can make hazelnut milk out of them. You can do nut butter. You can press them for oil. You can even use them in desserts or simply eat them as they are. Now, as for wildlife value, it's an excellent wildlife shrub. So the flowers are wind pollinated. They don't actually provide much value to pollinators. However, the nuts do provide an excellent food source for all kinds of wildlife, including squirrels and birds. Now, the leaves of hazelnut, they go on to feed caterpillars of many butterfly species and moth species, such as the Crocopia and Polyphemus moths. Now, these are two of the largest moth species in North America. And we're often taught that insects eating our plants is a bad thing. But is it really that bad if we get these beautiful butterflies and moths out of it? So our next plant is common milkweed, which we're probably all familiar with, but not many people understand its edible qualities. Now, I was dubious about putting this on the presentation because milkweed does have a white milky sap that's mildly toxic to humans. However, it does have edible properties during multiple stages of its life. Now, we have many species of milkweed in Ontario, but it's important to note that common milkweed is the only edible species. Now, there's 3 stages where you can eat it. The first one is the young shoots that can be used like asparagus. Now, then next, the flowers can be used in jams, juices, syrups, and even salads. I've made a simple syrup out of milkweed flowers, and it's excellent when poured onto ice cream or even poured into carbonated water for a drink. So the floral taste of the flowers, it really reminds me of summer every time I drink it. And finally, the young pods, they can be prepared similar to okra, and they also have a very similar taste to okra, but they don't have that slimy texture. Now they can even be pickled, although I've never tried it. I would like to try them pickled. Now, milkweed, of course, has enormous wildlife value. If you want the most wildlife bang for your buck, then you really need a milkweed in your garden. It feeds many insect species, including the monarch butterfly and the milkweed tussock moth, which are both pictured here. Now, the flowers are also a big hit with pollinators of all kinds, including the American lady butterfly on screen. And when it's in bloom, there's honestly no flower in my yard that's more popular with pollinators. So now some people might think that by eating milkweed, we're essentially reducing food source for monarchs. But the way I see it is that being able to eat it gives us even more incentive to grow it. And that's definitely beneficial for monarch butterflies if we harvest the milkweed sustainably. Now our next plant is pawpaw. It's quite unknown outside of the native plant community, but that's definitely changing. Now it's found in deciduous forests, floodplains, stream sides, and ravines. And they basically like dappled shades of part sun with rich, moist, well-draining soil. Now, they're quite rare in the wild in Ontario due to deforestation. And this is part of the reason why many people haven't heard of it. So although they naturally grow in the shade, they can grow very well in full sun if the ground is moist and well drained, and they're not exposed to really harsh winds. Now, pawpaw is often described as a cross between a mango and a banana. They're ready to harvest around September, and you know that they're ready to harvest when they're soft to the touch. Now, pawpaws don't store very well, which is why you don't see them on the shelves in the store. And because of this, they're best enjoyed straight from the tree, or you might have to freeze them or process them into ice cream. Some people will make pies or bread or even beer out of them. Now, all kinds of wildlife will enjoy the pawpaw fruit. The flowers are mainly pollinated by flies, but it's the leaves that feed the caterpillars of the zebra swallowtail. Now, earlier in this century, the zebra swallowtail was a regular breeder in Ontario, and it was sometimes seen in very large numbers here. But in more recent years, we've lost a lot of our pawpaws, and due to the rarity of pawpaw, this butterfly is now very sporadically seen here. So this is part of the reason why choosing native plants is so important. We've destroyed so much habitat that we're literally pushing some species to extinction just because they don't have the native plants that they rely on. So just by growing some of these plants in our yard, we can start to bring back some of our natural heritage. So our next plant is spicebush. Now this is found in moist deciduous woods, floodplains, and shorelines. Now in your garden, it'll do well in average to moist soil, in part shades of full sun. I find the more sun it has, the more moisture that it needs. Now, this plant's thought of as the wild forsythia because it flowers around the same time as forsythia, and you can see that it looks fairly similar as well. Now, it has these really nice tropical looking leaves, and in the fall, they turn into this beautiful yellow color. And if you want the red berries, then you need to have a female plant and a male plant to pollinate it. Now, the leaves and stems, they release a really nice sweet fragrance when crushed, which brings me to the edibility. So it's most famously used for tea. The leaves and the twigs can be used to make a nice fruity tea. And if you have a female and at least one male plant, then the shrubs will also produce these red berry-like fruit, which are edible, and they're often used as an alternative to allspice. Now, spicebush blooms in late March, early April, so it provides a really important food source for pollinators as they emerge from winter. So the leaves are eaten by caterpillars of the spicebush swallowtail, which is most common in the most southwestern part of Ontario, where spicebush is more common in the wild. So next up, we have New Jersey tea. So this is a small shrub, gets to about 1 meter high at the most, and it's usually found in prairies, glades, open woods. So it really does best in dry, sunny areas, but it will adapt to most gardens as long as you have well-draining soil and plenty of sun. Now, it does have a very deep taproot, so the bonus is that this is very drought tolerant, but on the downside, it means it's very hard to transplant once established, so make sure you choose its location very wisely. So you may have guessed by its name, we can use it for tea. So the leaves were used by Native Americans, but it also became popular during the American Revolutionary War when tea imports from England stopped, and this was used as a substitute. So it tastes similar to black tea, but it doesn't have any caffeine in it. And whether that's a good or a bad thing is up to you. Now we have many other, oh, sorry, I skipped a slide there. So the leaves actually feed caterpillars of the spring azure and the summer azure butterfly. So the flowers are a big hit with pollinators, just like this bicolored sweat bee on screen. And they're even popular with hummingbirds. Now the seeds will persist throughout winter. Sometimes birds will eat them. But unfortunately for the gardener, rabbits and deer love this plant too. So if you're going to grow it, you'll definitely have to protect it during its early years. Now we have many other native plants that can be used as tea. So on screen, you can see wild bergamot. It makes a very nice minty tea and the flowers can be added into salads. Now mountain mint, as its name suggests, it makes a nice minty tea. I often pick it a leaf or two while in the garden. And you can see the flowers of the mountain mint are a buffet for pollinators, such as the striped hair-streaked butterfly. Now pale and purple coneflower leaves and their flowers can be made into tea as well, and it's often used to boost the immune system, immune function, and fend off colds and flu. Now our next edible plant would be cutleaf coneflower. So this likes areas with rich, moist soil and floodplains or wetlands. So in your garden, it'll do well in most soils as long as they don't dry out completely. And it does like full to part sun. Now the flower stalks, they're very tall and they can be floppy if there's no other plants to support them. So I'd recommend planting it with some moisture loving companions, such as Joe Pieweed. So two parts of this plant are edible. First of all, the young shoots can be eaten in early spring. They're very similar to asparagus. And as a bonus, they actually emerge much earlier than asparagus. Now, the most commonly eaten part would be the leaf, which can be used as a cooked green similar to spinach. And they can be harvested throughout the growing season, but the leaves do get tougher and develop a stronger flavor as the season goes on, but they're still perfectly edible. Now the flowers, they're visited by many different pollinators, including bumblebees, butterflies, moths, and skippers. If you leave your garden standing over winter, then you'll definitely see a lot of birds, such as goldfinches, feasting on the seeds. Now you're often going to see a double blooming version of this plant in gardens. And while it does look pretty, the double blooms of highly cultivated varieties such as this, they make nectar really inaccessible to pollinators. Now this is either because they can't reach it through all of the petals or the nectar and pollen just don't exist to begin with. So generally it's best to avoid highly cultivated double blooms like this. So next up we have chokeberry. Now it might not sound like a plant you want to eat, but hopefully I can convince you otherwise. So naturally it's found along stream sides, bogs, and other moist areas. Now it's a really adaptable shrub and it'll do well in most garden settings with sun to part shade, as long as the soil doesn't dry out completely. Now it does tend to sucker in wet conditions, which is good if you want to make dense cover for wildlife or fill in a really big area. Otherwise, you can just chop off the suckers as they come up. So in the springtime, it has these fragrant white flowers that you can see on screen there. They bloom for a couple weeks, and over summer, they'll develop into these beautiful black berries. Now, chokeberry also has amazing fall color, which ranges from an orange to a burgundy red. So how do we eat it? Well, the common name of chokeberry is in reference to the very tart flavor of the fruits. So you can still eat them raw, but they're going to make you pucker. So they're best used in jams, jellies, juices, and baking, wherever you can add sugar to kind of balance out their tartness. Now, chokeberries are noted for the very high levels of antioxidants and other nutrients. So this is an excellent wildlife shrub as well. Now, the pollinators will flock to the early spring flowers, and you can expect to see mason bees, mining bees, metallic green sweat bees, and even some butterflies visiting them. So birds will also enjoy the berries that form about midsummer. So if you're familiar with this plant, it's probably because it pops up in your lawn and it's trying to take over your garden. Now, common violets are in fact native and they're of really great value in our landscapes. So they make a really great ground cover around taller plants and will fill in any bare patches of soil in your garden. This is good because it protects the soil from erosion and from drying out. Now, this is important because healthy soil means healthy plants. And violets will basically grow well in any garden setting, and they can even tolerate some shade. Now the flowers and leaves, they can both be eaten. The leaves can be cooked like spinach, and I've even had them in a wild foraged sauerkraut mix with dandelion, nettle, and cabbage. Now the flowers, they can be either eaten as they are, or they can just be thrown into salads, eaten straight off the plant, or made into jams and jellies. So I actually like to make a violet jelly every year, and it comes out this beautiful deep purple color, and it makes gives you a really nice taste of springtime when you're in the middle of winter. Now, a great way to cook the flowers is to cover them in batter, like pancake batter, and then fry them up like pancakes. So the flowers are visited by bumblebees. They go for the nectar reserves. Now, the leaves themselves are eaten by caterpillars of variegated fritillary butterflies. So if you want these butterflies in your yard, then you definitely want to consider keeping some violets around to help feed them. Now, these violets are very common in lawns, and I think that cultural norms in our society have led us to believe that anything besides grass in our lawns is undesirable. And I really think this mindset needs to change, because while lawns and grass definitely have their use, they're essentially food deserts for wildlife. When we put all this time and money into maintaining a landscape that essentially requires life support, they only really exist for human desires, and they totally neglect the needs of wildlife. So lawn doesn't have to be just grass. The simple action of letting some weeds grow in our lawn can mean less maintenance for us and more habitat for wildlife. So that's all I have for you tonight. Some things to keep in mind are that you should always do your own research on edible native plants, because it's not good to make assumptions on what you're eating. Now, when I talked about today, it was not meant to be a definitive guide, but rather an introduction into the world of native edibles. So choosing plants by the scientific names will help ensure that you're eating the right plant. And if anybody's interested in acquiring some of these plants mentioned today, then just ask me or send me an email, because I either grow them at my own nursery or I know another nursery where you can get them. So I hope I've inspired you to see plants not only for the beauty they provide, but also for the services they provide, such as healthy food, supporting our wildlife. Now, I would like to open up for discussion and answer any questions.
Well, thanks a lot, Shaun. That was really interesting. It's good to know that we can have edibles in our garden and also feed the bees and the butterflies, and I guess even the deers and the squirrels, although
Yes.
sometimes I fight with them. So I'm going to go through the chat. It's been really interesting because people have been asking questions, and then other people on the call have been answering the questions, but we'll just go through some of them. There were a couple of questions about whether the recording, this talk was being recorded, and Shaun has very generously allowed us to record it, and it will be up. Nature Guelph now has a YouTube channel. You can look for that, and this talk will likely be up within the week on the YouTube channel. And I think maybe we'll announce on Facebook that when it's up. So let's get into some of the questions that we've come. Someone is saying that they have milkweed seeds that they saved from their old house, but they don't know what to do with them. So do you have any advice, Shaun? You're a great grower, of what to do with milkweed seeds?
Yeah, so the best way and the easiest way to grow them is to put them in a pot full of potting soil and just leave them outside over winter. Definitely protect them from rodents with some wire mesh. But that's definitely the easiest way to grow them, because they need to be stratified for, I believe, 60 days. So it's probably a little bit too late now to start them, but there is one strategy. If you're kind of on a time crunch, you can put them into a moist paper towel, put them into a Ziploc bag, and then you put them into the fridge for a day. Then you take them out and put them into the freezer. Then the next day, put them into the fridge, and you just keep repeating that for about a week or two. And that, for a lot of species, that will help awaken them, and it'll help mimic the longer period of stratification that they need.
Okay, and I'll also tell people, if you do go to the Nature Guelph YouTube channel, We had a speaker in March about how to grow native plants from seed, and you can see that that recording will be up on the YouTube channel. We have a comment more than a question that eating homegrown wild leeks is okay, but wild harvesting has made wild leeks already an endangered plant in Quebec. And I think you did make that point, but we'll just make that again. And somebody else suggests that you eat wild garlic mustard, which is invasive, and eat it instead of the leeks.
Oh, I totally agree. Yeah. Garlic mustard makes a very nice pesto, and you can even throw it into salads and even saute it like spinach.
Yeah, I have seen some references that not eating onion has some toxicity. Do you know if that is true? Is it actually good to eat not eating onion?
I believe it's okay to eat sparingly, so I wouldn't eat an entire plant at once. But if you're just picking a couple leaves, to throw in like an omelet or something, I don't think that's a problem.
Somebody did ask if, they said the same plant as Virginia creeper. I think they were wondering if Virginia waterleaf was the same plant as Virginia creeper. And of course, a couple people answered that they're quite different plants. And in fact, Virginia creeper is toxic and should not be eaten.
Yes, that's very true.
Okay. And then a question I have is broadleaf waterleaf also edible, just like the Virginia waterleaf?
To be honest, I'm not entirely sure.
I have a lot of that. So for those of you on the call that are planning to come to the Nature Guelph virtual wildflower sale, if we have it, there will be a lot of broadleaf waterleaf at that sale. I was kind of hoping it was edible. Okay, so
I'm going to have to look that up because I want to know too now.
yeah, I was just thinking if they're the same genus, maybe they should be.
I would guess that they are, but I don't want to say yes or no right now.
Okay, they're. Did you say the flowers are also edible? Because they're quite pretty. Or is it just?
I believe they are.
Yeah, they would be nice in a salad too. They're quite attractive. Someone's asking if Canada plum is affected by black knot.
Yeah, it would be affected by anything that affects a prunus species.
And
I'm not sure how affected or how common it is compared to a cultivated variety, but I'm sure it would be. Yeah.
Okay. And another question, do you need 2 plum trees for fruit, or would you get fruit from 1 plum tree?
I believe you'd get much better fruit production from 2. And they're often used as a pollinating species for cultivated plums.
Okay. We have quite a few people commenting on how tasty elderberry is. We have someone asking which one of these plants grow in the north. And I think they asked the question about the time you were talking about elderberry and redbud. So do you have any comments on about how far north we can grow some of those?
So I live in Orangeville and I grow redbud no problem. I've heard of people growing it further north towards Wasaga Beach, but I think beyond that you might kind of be on the brink of being able to grow it there.
Thanks. And let's see. Do hazel shrubs have male and female plants? I'm pretty sure the answer to that is that they don't, that you get male and female on the same plant. Is that true?
Yeah, I believe so. So if you just have one plant, you'll still get nuts, but you'll definitely get a lot more if you have 2 plants.
And someone's asking, how many hazelnut shrubs would you need to plant together to produce a sizable harvest of hazelnut? So I'm not sure what we mean by sizable, but I guess maybe the question would be, how many hazelnuts would you get from one shrub?
Well, once it's mature and if it's really happy where it is, they get pretty big. So I think 1 to 3 shrubs would be enough for a small family.
Okay.
Once they're mature.
And no, I think this was a comment about milkweeds to only eat the pods if the seeds are white. And someone else suggests stuffing the pods with cheese and baking them.
Yeah, so the pods, they can only really be eaten when they're the size that I showed in the picture. So a little bit smaller than your thumb.
Did you have particular ways to cook the pods?
Yeah, so you can just fry them or saute them, similar to okra. That's the only way that I've ever tried them. But I've heard of people kind of battering them like chicken wings.
We have a question about, can you chew on the bark? I think that was probably about spice bush. Would the bark of
Yeah,
spice
so
bush have a
with
taste?
spice bush, you can take a twig and chew on it. So that, yeah, pretty much every part of it's edible.
And are other Rudbeckia edible besides the lanceolata?
Not that I'm aware of.
So that's the only one? Too bad, because it's such a garden thug. And a question about the non-native Viola odoranto. Is it edible? So that's the little non-native that's pretty common.
I'm not
It's called
actually too
sweet
sure.
violet.
I believe most violas are edible, but I wouldn't want to say for sure before looking that up.
And then we have a question is, how can you tell which of the violets are the native ones as opposed to the sweet violet, which is non-native?
Well, violets are very tricky to identify it. So it'd be a little bit hard to explain it over video.
So what we need is a good field guide.
Good field guide, yes.
Okay.
I would probably recommend a good field guide for any of these plants, unless you're buying it directly from a grower and it's labeled properly. But yeah, if you're just going out there to forage, definitely get a field guide.
And Shaun, does your nursery sell wild leeks?
No, not at the moment. I am working on it. They take a very long time to grow, so it's a really long time investment. But I'm hoping within a few years I'll have some that are big enough to grow or to sell.
And I will just say that if you come to the Nature Guelph Wildflower Society that we're having in conjunction with Pollination Guelph and the Enabling Garden, there will be at least half a dozen wild leeks for sale that I've dug from my garden. The only problem is by the time we have the sale, they may be dormant, and you'll just have to believe that those wild leeks are in those empty pots.
Yeah, that's why a lot of spring ephemerals are hard to sell.
I'm looking to see, we have, someone's asking, where is your nursery?
So it's located in Mono, just off of Airport Road. But we also have a pickup location just outside of Orangeville.
And are you open for visitors, or is it strictly order and wholesale?
Right now, we're just doing curbside pickup at our location just outside of Orangeville. But we're working on installing some nice big demonstration gardens. So we hope in the future that we'll be able to have people come through and check out the gardens.
Someone is asking about mullein, who they discovered at our cottage. I think that's not, in fact, native, but do you know anything about it?
Yeah, so it's not native, but I believe it was smoked to kind of clear out like a chest infection. But beyond that, I'm not too sure.
Someone is asking if you are building food forests in other places besides your nursery.
Yeah, so I've done two food forests now. They're still very young, but they're doing well. And I do try to include edibles in just regular gardens and kind of encourage clients to learn more about it. And we are doing a food forest at the nursery as well.
And I'll tell those who are in Guelph and interested, there is a Guelph food forest. It's only a couple of years old, but the people running it are always looking for volunteers. I think you can find it online, but you could also find it from the City of Guelph Healthy Landscapes website. You can find out about the food forest. Let's see. So someone's asking about the zones for the plants. Like, for example, the pawpaw and the New Jersey tea. Do you know what the north end of the range for those is?
Yeah, so pawpaw, it was really only found around the most southwest of Ontario, kind of hugging the shore of Lake Erie, going by Niagara, and then kind of going up along the Golden Horseshoe. But it does grow outside of that range. So I grow some here in Orangeville, and they do really well. I've even heard of people growing them up in Collingwood. So I think that's going above or past that is kind of pushing it. But they will grow well outside of their historic range.
Okay.
And as
And
for New Jersey tea, uh, I believe there's natural populations just west or east of Lake Simcoe. So they're fairly hardy.
Someone's asking about when you're making violet jelly, how many cups of flowers do you need to make jelly?
I typically do, when I do the recipe, I do about, I haven't made it for a while, about 2 to 3 cups. So it does take a while to pick enough flowers, but it's definitely worth it.
Okay. Um, okay, I'm just looking. So a lot of these are thanking you. Oh, someone looked up, all the water leaves are edible. So someone looked it up on the internet.
Oh, perfect.
Okay. Someone has a struggling elderberry and wondering, can you recommend the best growing conditions for elderberry?
Yeah, so if the elderberry got to choose where you put it, it would want to be in full sun and moist soil. If it's not doing well, it might be a little bit too dry for it. So if it's in full sun, it does really need to be in moist soil. If it has a little bit of protection from the afternoon sun, then it can tolerate slightly drier conditions.
Okay, thank you. Someone here is from about 600 kilometers north of Guelph, and they have hazelnut trees there. So that's sort of encouraging. We've got some questions on pawpaw saplings, and there's some answers there. Do you sell those at your nursery too?
No, not at the moment. But there are a few nurseries that do sell them. If you go to the Ontario Native Plant Gardening Facebook group, you'll find a list of native plant suppliers. And there are some near Guelph. Be Sweet Nature, I believe, would sell them. They're in Push Lynch.
Okay, thank you. If you had come to the Wildflower Seed Workshop in March, you would have gotten some pawpaw seeds. So there you go. You could try it yourself. Do you have a recommended field guide for South Central Ontario for edible and inedible native plants?
I believe I do have a field guide. I believe it's a Peterson's field guide. I don't actually have it here.
Yeah.
But if you just look up Peterson's field guide for edible plants of Eastern North America, it has a green cover.
And if you're looking for a really good field guide for all native plants, I would recommend Newcomb's, but it doesn't mention whether
That's a good
edible
one too.
Okay. Does your nursery have a website?
Yes. So if you just look at the first link up here, innernature.ca. Yeah, that'll take you to the homepage. Then you can find links there to my resources, which are just educational posts on native plants. And you can also find a link to the online store there.
And thanks, Denise says she bought a wild leek from the Wildflower Society last year and it came up this spring. So you can trust the empty pots.
Yeah, it's exciting stuff.
Okay, so, oh, someone's asking, would bee balm, they have bee balm growing in Deep River, north of Ottawa. So that's a long way up. So a couple of people said they arrived late, and I'll repeat that we should have a recording of this up on the Nature Guelph YouTube channel by next week, I would think. And someone's asking, Shaun, if you need extra pots. So do you?
Yeah, we definitely try to recycle pots. So if you have a 3.5 inch to 4 inch pots, or 1 gallon pots, or 5.5 inch pots, then yeah, I'll definitely take them.
Okay. How would people get pots to you?
Uh, Depends where you are. I could come pick them up from you.
Okay.
If you just want to send me an email, just to the email that you see on the screen here, in our nature gardens at Gmail, then we can try and coordinate something.
Okay. So I think I've gone through the questions, unless anyone's got more questions for Shaun. That was a really informative discussion. I'd also, I really like this talk because Shaun was telling us how to grow these edible natives in our own yards, and that will keep us out of the woods and keep us from removing the plants from the wild where they're struggling. So I just like to remind everybody, if you are interested in foraging, that in Southern Ontario, foraging is probably really destructive to plants. We're going to be losing our plants. And we'd also like to remind everybody that when you do, if you do plant a forage, you really need to, you cannot forage on land you do not own. So parkland, trailside land, conservation land, Indian land, all that land is not land that you should be foraging on. You can ask landowners, if they're private landowners, if you can go on through the land to forest, the same way that deer hunters usually ask people if they can use their land. So thanks so much, Shaun, for encouraging us to grow these native plants in our own yards instead of from the forest. And we do get a couple of extra questions came in just now, and someone's asking about wild ginger, which I don't think you mentioned.
No, so wild ginger is edible. You can use it. You can use the rhizomes. They have a very strong ginger flavor. You can kind of candy them with by boiling them in sugar. I I believe it's not something you want to eat too much of. It could make you sick, but if you're just having a little bit of it, like a couple pieces of it that are candied, and I don't think it's going to be an issue. But yeah, it's definitely edible.
Okay, so I think we are at the end of the questions. So people, oh, someone's asking about ginseng. I don't know if it even grows in this area, and if I did know where it was, I would certainly not tell you where it was. Most ginseng in Southern Ontario would be on ginseng farms, would it not, Shaun?
Yeah, it's very rare here now. Once again, due to overharvesting, and it takes a very long time to grow and reproduce from seed as well, which is a big reason why it's so uncommon now.
I think also the farm ginseng has a disease that can be spread to the wild population too, fungal disease. So I think I think we are at the end of the questions, and thank you very much. Remember that the presentation will be up on YouTube shortly, and everybody please check out the Ontario Native Plant Gardening Facebook page, and check out Nature Guelph's Facebook page and the Guelph Community Nature Facebook page, and we may see more information about edible plants. And we have one last question, Shaun. They keep coming in about eating May apples.
All right, so May apples you have to be very careful with. So the fruit is edible, but if it's underripe, it can actually be very, it can make you sick. So you have to wait until they're very, very ripe. So they'll be yellow with a little bit of brown spots on it, kind of like a banana. But once you do harvest them, you can use them in jellies, and you can use them in baking. Not sure how else to use them, but they have kind of like a tropical uh, taste. So they are very good, and they're fairly common around here. So they're an excellent plant to grow for food, but you do have to be very careful.
Okay, So I think we are finally at the end of the questions. There are lots of people thanking you, Shaun, and we really enjoyed this. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you hopefully next month.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so I'll leave that up just for a minute in case people want to join, copy out the emails, and then we'll be closing down the event in a few minutes. So bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Goodbye. Thank you, Shaun. That was great.
Thank you. Glad you enjoyed it.
Okay, so the crowd is thinning out, so we'll say bye-bye and thanks again, Shaun. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you. Have a good night.